The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 25. On the evening of the day after the funeral, Roaring Abel went off for a spree. He had been sober for 4 whole days and could endure it no longer. Before he went, Valancy told him she would be going away the next day. Roaring Abel was sorry and said so. A distant cousin from up back was coming to keep house for him, quite willing to do so now, since there was no sick girl to wait on. But Abel was not under any delusions concerning her. "She won't be like you, my girl. Well, I'm obliged to you. You helped me out of a bad hole, and I won't forget it. And I won't forget what you did for Sissy. I'm your friend, and if you ever want any of the Stirlings spanked and sought in a corner, send for me. I'm going to wet my whistle, Lord, but I'm dry. Don't reckon I'll be back afore tomorrow night, so if you're going home tomorrow, goodbye now." "I may go home tomorrow," said Valancy, "but I'm not going to Deerwood." "Not going? You'll find the key on the woodshed nail," interrupted Valancy politely and unmistakably. "The dog will be in the barn and the cat in the cellar. Don't forget to feed her till your cousin comes. The pantry is full, and I made some bread and pies today. Goodbye, Mr. Gay. You have been very kind to me, and I appreciate it." "We've had a damned decent time of it together, and that's a fact," said Roaring Abel. "You're the best small sport in the world, and your little finger is worth the whole Stirling clan tied together. Goodbye, and good luck." Valancy went out to the garden. Her legs trembled a little, but otherwise she felt and looked composed. She held something tightly in her hand. The garden was lying in the magic of the warm, odorous July twilight. A few stars were out, and the robins were calling through the velvety silences of the barrens. Valancy stood by the gate expectantly. Would he come? If he did not, he was coming. Valancy heard Lady Jane Grey far back in the woods. Her breath came a little more quickly, nearer and nearer. She could see Lady Jane now, bumping down the lane. Nearer, nearer. He was there. He had sprung from the car and was leaning over the gate, looking at her. "Going home, Miss Stirling?" "I don't know yet," said Valancy slowly. Her mind was made up with no shadow of turning, but the moment was very tremendous. "I thought I'd run down and ask if there was anything I could do for you," said Barney. Valancy took it with a canter. "Yes, there is something you can do for me," she said evenly and distinctly. "Will you marry me?" For a moment Barney was silent. There was no particular expression on his face. Then he gave an odd laugh. "Come now, I knew luck was just waiting around the corner for me. All the signs have been pointing that way today." "Wait," Valancy lifted her hand. "I'm in earnest. But I want to get my breath after that question. Of course, with my bringing up, I realize perfectly well that this is one of the things a lady should not do." "But why? Why?" "For 2 reasons." Valancy was still a little breathless, but she looked Barney straight in the eyes, while all the dead Stirlings revolved rapidly in their graves, and the living ones did nothing because they did not know that Valancy was at that moment proposing lawful marriage to the notorious Barney Snaith. "The first reason is, Valancy tried to say I love you, but could not. She had to take refuge in a pretended flippancy. "I'm crazy about you. The second is this." She handed him Dr. Trent's letter. Barney opened it with the air of a man thankful to find some safe, sane thing to do. As he read it, his face changed. He understood, more perhaps than Valancy wanted him to. "Are you sure nothing can be done for you?" Valancy did not misunderstand the question. "Yes. You know Dr. Trent's reputation in regard to heart disease. I haven't long to live, perhaps only a few months, a few weeks. I want to live them. I can't go back to Deerwood. You know what my life was like there, and she managed it this time. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. That's all. Barney folded his arms on the gate and looked gravely enough at a white, saucy star that was winking at him just over Roaring Abel's kitchen chimney. You don't know anything about me. I may be a murderer. No, I don't. You may be something dreadful. Everything they say of you may be true, but it doesn't matter to me. You care that much for me, Valancy? Said Barney incredulously, looking away from the star and into her eyes, her strange, mysterious eyes. I care that much, said Valancy in a low voice. She was trembling. He had called her by her name for the first time. It was sweeter than another man's caress could have been just to hear him say her name like that. If we are going to get married, said Barney, speaking suddenly in a casual, matter-of-fact voice, some things must be understood. Everything must be understood, said Valancy. I have things I want to hide, said Barney coolly. You are not to ask me about them. I won't, said Valancy. You must never ask to see my mail. Never. And we are never to pretend anything to each other. We won't, said Valancy. You won't even have to pretend you like me. If you marry me, I know you're only doing it out of pity. And we'll never tell a lie to each other about anything, a big lie or a petty lie. Especially a petty lie, agreed Valancy. And you'll have to live on my island. I won't live anywhere else. That's partly why I want to marry you, said Valancy. Barney peered at her. I believe you mean it. Well, let's get married then. Thank you, said Valancy with a sudden return of primness. She would have been much less embarrassed if he had refused her. I suppose I haven't any right to make conditions, but I'm going to make one. You are never to refer to my heart or my liability to sudden death. You are never to urge me to be careful. You are to forget, absolutely forget, that I am not perfectly healthy. I have written a letter to my mother. Here it is. You are to keep it. I have explained everything in it. If I drop dead suddenly, as I likely will do, it will exonerate me in the eyes of your kindred from suspicions of having poisoned you, said Barney with a grin. Exactly, Valancy laughed gaily. Dear me, I'm glad this is over. It has been a bit of an ordeal. You see, I'm not in the habit of going about asking men to marry me. It is so nice of you not to refuse me, or offer to be a brother. I'll go to the port tomorrow and get a license. We can be married tomorrow evening. Dr. Stirling, I suppose. Heavens, no, Valancy shuddered. Besides, he wouldn't do it. He'd shake his forefinger at me, and I'd jilt you at the altar. No, I want my old Mr. Towers to marry me. Will you marry me as I stand? Demanded Barney. A passing car full of tourists honked loudly. It seemed derisively. Valancy looked at him. Blue homespun shirt, nondescript hat, muddy overalls, unshaved. Yes, she said. Barney put his hands over the gate and took her little cold ones gently in his. Valancy, he said, trying to speak lightly, of course I am not in love with you. Never thought of such a thing as being in love. But do you know, I've always thought you were a bit of a dear. End of chapter 25. The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 26. The next day passed for Valancy like a dream. She could not make herself or anything she did seem real. She saw nothing of Barney, though she expected he must go rattling past on his way to the port for a license. Perhaps he had changed his mind. But at dusk the lights of Lady Jane suddenly swooped over the crest of the wooded hill beyond the lane. Valancy was waiting at the gate for her bridegroom. She wore her green dress and her green hat, because she had nothing else to wear. She did not look or feel at all bride-like. She really looked like a wild elf strayed out of the greenwood. But that did not matter. Nothing at all mattered, except Barney was coming for her. "Ready?" said Barney, stopping Lady Jane with some new horrible noises. "Yes." Valancy stepped in and sat down. Barney was in his blue shirt and overalls, but they were clean overalls. He was smoking a villainous-looking pipe, and he was bareheaded, but he had a pair of oddly smart boots on under his shabby overalls, and he was shaved. They clattered into Deerwood and through Deerwood and hit the long wooded road to the port. "Haven't you changed your mind?" said Barney. "No. Have you?" "No." That was their whole conversation on the 15 miles. Everything was more dreamlike than ever. Valancy didn't know whether she felt happy or terrified or just plain fool. Then the lights of Port Lawrence were about them. Valancy felt as if she were surrounded by the gleaming, hungry eyes of hundreds of great, stealthy panthers. Barney briefly asked where Mr. Towers lived, and Valancy as briefly told him. They stopped before the shabby little house in an unfashionable street. They went into the small, shabby parlor. Barney produced his license, so he had got it. Also, a ring. This ring was real. She, Valancy Stirling, was actually on the point of being married. They were standing up together before Mr. Towers. Valancy heard Mr. Towers and Barney saying things. She heard some other person saying things. She herself was thinking of the way she had once planned to be married. Away back in her early teens, when such a thing had not seemed impossible. White silk and tulle veil and orange blossoms. No bridesmaid, but one flower girl in a frock of cream shadow lace over pale pink, with a wreath of flowers in her hair, carrying a basket of roses and lilies of the valley. And the groom, a noble-looking character, irreproachably clad in whatever the fashion of the day decreed. Valancy lifted her eyes and saw herself and Barney in the little slanting, distorted mirror over the mantelpiece. She in her odd, unbridled green hat and dress, Barney in shirt and overalls. But it was Barney. That was all that mattered. No veil, no flowers, no guests, no presents, no wedding cake, but just Barney. For all the rest of her life there would be Barney. "Mrs. Snaith, I hope you will be very happy," Mr. Towers was saying. He had not seemed surprised at their appearance, not even at Barney's overalls. He had seen plenty of queer weddings up back. He did not know Valancy was one of the Deerwood Stirlings. He did not even know there were Deerwood Stirlings. He did not know Barney Snaith was a fugitive from justice. Really, he was an incredibly ignorant old man. Therefore, he married them and gave them his blessing very gently and solemnly and prayed for them that night after they had gone away. His conscience did not trouble him at all. "What a nice way to get married," Barney was saying as he put Lady Jane in gear. "No fuss and flub-dub. I never supposed it was half so easy." "For heaven's sake," said Valancy suddenly, "let's forget we are married and talk as if we weren't. I can't stand another drive like the one we had coming in." Barney howled and threw Lady Jane into high with an infernal noise. "And I thought I was making it easy for you," he said. "You didn't seem to want to talk." "I didn't, but I wanted you to talk. I don't want you to make love to me, but I want you to act like an ordinary human being. Tell me about this island of yours. What sort of place is it?" "The jolliest place in the world. You're going to love it. The first time I saw it, I loved it. Old Tom Montgomery owned it then. He built the little shack on it, lived there in winter, and rented it to Toronto people in summer. I bought it from him, became by that one simple transaction a landed proprietor, owning a house and an island. There's something so satisfying in owning a whole island. And isn't an uninhabited island a charming idea? I'd wanted to own one ever since I'd read Robinson Crusoe. It seemed too good to be true. And beauty! Most of the scenery belongs to the government, but they don't tax you for looking at it. And the moon belongs to everybody. You won't find my shack very tidy. I suppose you'll want to make it tidy." "Yes," said Valancy honestly. "I have to be tidy. I don't really want to be, but untidiness hurts me. Yes, I'll have to tidy up your shack." "I was prepared for that," said Barney with a hollow groan. "But," continued Valancy relentingly, "I won't insist on your wiping your feet when you come in." "No, you'll only sweep up after me with the air of a martyr," said Barney. "Well, anyway, you can't tidy up the lean-to. You can't even enter it. The door will be locked, and I shall keep the key." "Bluebeard's chamber," said Valancy. "I shan't even think of it. I don't care how many wives you have hanging up in it, so long as they're really dead. Dead as doornails. You can do as you like in the rest of the house. There's not much of it. Just one big living room and one small bedroom. Well built, though. Old Tom loved his job. The beams of our house are cedar and the rafters fir. Our living room windows face west and east. It's wonderful to have a room where you can see both sunrise and sunset. I have 2 cats there, Banjo and Good Luck. Adorable animals. Banjo is a big, enchanting gray devil cat. Striped, of course. I don't care a hang for any cat that hasn't stripes. I never knew a cat who could swear as genteelly and effectively as Banjo. His only fault is that he snores horribly when he is asleep. Luck is a dainty little cat, always looking wistfully at you as if he wanted to tell you something. Maybe he will pull it off sometime. Once in 1,000 years, you know, one cat is allowed to speak. My cats are philosophers. Neither of them ever cries over spilt milk. 2 old crows live in a pine tree on the point and are reasonably neighborly. Call 'em Nip and Tuck. And I have a demure little tame owl named Leander. I brought him up from a baby, and he lives over on the mainland and chuckles to himself o' nights. And bats? It's a great place for bats at night. Scared of bats? No, I like them. So do I. Nice, queer, uncanny, mysterious creatures. Coming from nowhere, going nowhere. Swoop. Banjo likes 'em too. Eats 'em. I have a canoe and a disappearing propeller boat. Went to the port in it today to get my license. Quieter than Lady Jane. I thought you hadn't gone at all, that you had changed your mind, admitted Valancy. Barney laughed. The laugh Valancy did not like, the little bitter, cynical laugh. "I never change my mind," he said shortly. They went back through Deerwood, up the Muskoka Road, past Roaring Abel's, over the rocky daisied lane. The dark pine woods swallowed them up. Through the pine woods, where the air was sweet with the incense of the unseen fragile bells of the linneas that carpeted the banks of the trail, out to the shore of Mistawis. Lady Jane must be left here. They got out. Barney led the way down a little path to the edge of the lake. "There's our island," he said gloatingly. Valancy looked and looked and looked again. There was a diaphanous lilac mist on the lake, shrouding the island. Through it the 2 enormous pine trees that clasped hands over Barney's shack loomed out like dark turrets. Behind them was a sky still rose-hued in the afterlight and a pale young moon. Valancy shivered like a tree the wind stirs suddenly. Something seemed to sweep over her soul. "My blue castle," she said. "Oh, my blue castle." They got into the canoe and paddled out to it. They left behind the realm of everyday and things known and landed on a realm of mystery and enchantment where anything might happen, anything might be true. Barney lifted Valancy out of the canoe and swung her to a lichen-covered rock under a young pine tree. His arms were about her, and suddenly his lips were on hers. Valancy found herself shivering with the rapture of her first kiss. "Welcome home, dear," Barney was saying. End of chapter 26.
Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 27. Cousin Georgiana came down the lane leading up to her little house. She lived half a mile out of Deerwood, and she wanted to go into Amelia's and find out if Dawes had come home yet. Cousin Georgiana was anxious to see Dawes. She had something very important to tell her, something she was sure Dawes would be delighted to hear. Poor Dawes. She had had rather a dull life of it. Cousin Georgiana owned to herself that she would not like to live under Amelia's thumb. But that would all be changed now. Cousin Georgiana felt tremendously important. For the time being, she quite forgot to wonder which of them would go next. And here was Dawes herself, coming along the road from Roaring Abel's in such a queer green dress and hat. Talk about luck! Cousin Georgiana would have a chance to impart her wonderful secret right away, with nobody else about to interrupt. It was, you might say, Providence. Valancy, who had been living for 4 days on her enchanted island, had decided that she might as well go into Deerwood and tell her relatives that she was married. Otherwise, finding that she had disappeared from Roaring Abel's, they might get out a search warrant for her. Barney had offered to drive her in, but she had preferred to go alone. She smiled very radiantly at Cousin Georgiana, who she remembered as of someone known long time ago, had really not been a bad little creature. Valancy was so happy that she could have smiled at anybody, even Uncle James. She was not averse to Cousin Georgiana's company. Already, since the houses along the road were becoming numerous, she was conscious that curious eyes were looking at her from every window. "I suppose you're going home, dear Dawes," said Cousin Georgiana, as she shook hands furtively eyeing Valancy's dress and wondering if she had any petticoat on at all. "Sooner or later," said Valancy cryptically. "Then I'll go along with you. I've been wanting to see you very especially, Dawes dear. I have something quite wonderful to tell you." "Yes?" said Valancy absently. What on earth was Cousin Georgiana looking so mysterious and important about? But did it matter? No, nothing mattered but Barney and the blue castle up back in Mistervis. "Who do you suppose called to see me the other day?" asked Cousin Georgiana archly. Valancy couldn't guess. "Edward Beck." Cousin Georgiana lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "Edward Beck." Why the italics? And was Cousin Georgiana blushing? "Who on earth is Edward Beck?" asked Valancy indifferently. Cousin Georgiana stared. "Surely you remember Edward Beck," she said reproachfully. "He lives in that lovely house on the Port Lawrence Road, and he comes to our church regularly. You must remember him." "Oh, I think I do now," said Valancy with an effort of memory. "He is that old man with a wen on his forehead and dozens of children who always sits in the pew by the door, isn't he?" "Not dozens of children, dear. Oh, no, not dozens. Not even 1 dozen. Only 9. At least only 9 that count. The rest are dead. He isn't old. He is only about 48, the prime of life. Dawes, and what does it matter about a wen?" "Nothing, of course," agreed Valancy quite sincerely. It certainly did not matter to her whether Edward Beck had a wen, or a dozen wens, or no wen at all. But Valancy was getting vaguely suspicious. There was certainly an air of suppressed triumph about Cousin Georgiana. Could it be possible that Cousin Georgiana was thinking of marrying again? Marrying Edward Beck? Absurd. Cousin Georgiana was 65. If she were a day, and her little anxious face was as closely covered with fine wrinkles as if she had been 100. But still, "My dear," said Cousin Georgiana, "Edward Beck wants to marry you." Valancy stared at Cousin Georgiana for a moment. Then she wanted to go into a peal of laughter. But she only said, "Me?" "Yes, you. He fell in love with you at the funeral, and he came to consult me about it. I was such a friend of his first wife, you know. He's very much in earnest, Dawsey, and it's a wonderful chance for you. He's very well off, and you know, you... "I'm not so young as I once was," agreed Valancy. "To her that shall be given. Do you really think I would make a good stepmother, Cousin Georgiana?" "I'm sure you would. You were always so fond of children." "But 9 is such a family to start with," objected Valancy gravely. "The 2 oldest are grown up, and the third almost. That leaves only 6 that really count, and most of them are boys. So much easier to bring up than girls. There's an excellent book, Health Care of the Growing Child. Gladys has a copy, I think. It would be such a help to you. And there are books about morals. You'd manage nicely. Of course, I told Mr. Beck that I thought you would jump at him, supplied Valancy. Oh, no, dear. I wouldn't use such an indelicate expression. I told him I thought you would consider his proposal favorably. And you will, won't you, dearie? There's only one obstacle, said Valancy dreamily. You see, I'm married already. Married? Cousin Georgiana stopped stock still and stared at Valancy. Married? Yes, I was married to Barney Smith last Tuesday evening at Port Lawrence. There was a convenient gate post hard by. Cousin Georgiana took firm hold of it. Doss, dear, I'm an old woman. Are you trying to make fun of me? Not at all. I'm only telling you the truth, for heaven's sake. Cousin Georgiana. Valancy was alarmed by certain symptoms. Don't go crying here on the public road. Cousin Georgiana choked back the tears and gave a moan of despair instead. Oh, Doss, what have you done? What have you done? I've just been telling you I've got married, said Valancy calmly and patiently. To that Barney Snaith? Why, they say he's had a dozen wives already. I'm the only one round at present, said Valancy. What will your poor mother say? Moaned Cousin Georgiana. Come along with me and hear if you want to know, said Valancy. Cousin Georgiana let go the gatepost cautiously and found that she could stand alone. She meekly trotted on beside Valancy, who suddenly seemed quite a different person in her eyes. Cousin Georgiana had a tremendous respect for a married woman, but it was terrible to think of what the poor girl had done. So rash, so reckless. Of course, Valancy must be stark mad, but she seemed so happy in her madness that Cousin Georgiana had a momentary conviction that it would be a pity if the clan tried to scold her back to sanity. She had never seen that look in Valancy's eyes before. But what would Amelia say? And Ben? To marry a man you know nothing about, thought Cousin Georgiana aloud. I know more about him than I know of Edward Beck, said Valancy. Edward Beck goes to church, said Cousin Georgiana. Does your husband? He has promised that he will go with me on fine Sundays, said Valancy. When they turned in at the Stirling gate, Valancy gave an exclamation of surprise. Look at my rose bush! Why, it's blooming! It was covered with blossoms, great, crimson, velvety blossoms, fragrant, glowing, wonderful. My cutting it down to pieces must have done it good, said Valancy, laughing. She gathered a handful of the blossoms. They would look well on the supper table of the veranda at Miss Tavis, and went still laughing up the walk, conscious that Olive was standing on the steps. Olive, goddess-like in loveliness, looking down with a slight frown on her forehead. Olive, beautiful, insolent, her full form voluptuous in its swathings of rose silk and lace, her golden brown hair curling richly under her big white-frilled hat, her color ripe and melting. Beautiful, thought Valancy coolly, but as if she suddenly saw her cousin through new eyes, without the slightest touch of distinction. So Valancy had come home. Thank goodness, thought Olive. But Valancy was not looking like a repentant returned prodigal. This was the cause of Olive's frown. She was looking triumphant, graceless. The outlandish dress, that queer hat, those hands full of blood-red roses. Yet, there was something about both dress and hat, as Olive instantly felt, that was entirely lacking in her own attire. This deepened the frown. She put out a condescending hand. So you're back, Doss? Very warm day, isn't it? Did you walk in? Yes. Coming in? Oh no, I've just been in. I've come often to comfort poor auntie. She's been so lonesome. I'm going to Mrs. Bartlett's tea. I have to help poor. She's giving it for her cousin from Toronto. Such a charming girl. You'd have loved meeting her, Doss. I think Mrs. Bartlett did send you a card. Perhaps you'll drop in later on. No, I don't think so, said Valancy indifferently. I'll have to be home to get Barney's supper. We're going for a moonlit canoe ride around Miss Tower tonight. Barney? Supper? Gasped Olive. What do you mean, Valancy Stirling? Valancy Snaith, by the grace of God. Valancy flaunted her wedding ring in Olive's stricken face. Then she nimbly stepped past her and into the house. Cousin Georgiana followed. She would not miss the moment of the great scene, even though Olive did look as if she were going to faint. Olive did not faint. She went stupidly down the street to Mrs. Bartlett's. What did those mean? She couldn't have that ring. Oh, what fresh scandal was that wretched girl bringing on her defenseless family now? She should have been shut up long ago. Valancy opened the sitting room door and stepped unexpectedly right into a grim assemblage of Stirlings. They had not come together of malice prepense. Aunt Wellington and Cousin Gladys and Aunt Mildred and Cousin Sarah had just called in on their way home from a meeting of the Missionary Society. Uncle James had dropped in to give Amelia some information regarding a doubtful investment. Uncle Benjamin had called, apparently, to tell them it was a hot day and ask them what was the difference between a bee and a donkey. Cousin Stickles had been tactless enough to know the answer. One gets all the honey, the other gets all the wax. And Uncle Benjamin was in a bad humor. In all of their minds, unexpressed was the idea of finding out if Valancy had yet come home, and if not, what steps must be taken in that matter. Well, here was Valancy at last. A poised, confident thing, not humble and deprecating as she should have been, and so oddly, improperly young-looking. She stood in the doorway and looked at them. Cousin Georgiana, timorous, expectant, behind her. Valancy was so happy. She didn't hate her people anymore. She could even see a number of good qualities in them that she had never seen before, and she was sorry for them. Her pity made her quite gentle. "Well, mother," she said pleasantly. "So, you've come home at last," said Mrs. Frederick, getting out a handkerchief. She dared not be outraged, but she did not mean to be cheated of her tears. "Well, not exactly," said Valancy. She threw her bomb. "I thought I ought to drop in and tell you I was married. Last Tuesday night, to Barney Snaith." Uncle Benjamin bounced up and sat down again. "God bless my soul," he said dully. The rest seemed turned to stone, except Cousin Gladys, who turned faint. Aunt Mildred and Uncle Wellington had to help her out to the kitchen. "She would have to keep up the Victorian traditions," said Valancy with a grin. She sat down uninvited on a chair. Cousin Stickles had begun to sob. "Is there one day in your life that you haven't cried?" asked Valancy curiously. "Valancy," said Uncle James, being the first to recover the power of utterance, "did you mean what you said just now?" "I did." "Do you mean to say that you have actually gone and married that notorious Barney Snaith, that criminal, that—" "I have." "Then," said Uncle James violently, "you are a shameless creature, lost to all sense of propriety and virtue, and I wash my hands entirely of you. I do not want ever to see your face again." "What have you left to say when I commit murder?" asked Valancy. Uncle Benjamin again appealed to God to bless his soul. "That drunken outlaw, that—" A dangerous spark appeared in Valancy's eyes. They might say what they liked too, and of her, but they should not abuse Barney. "Say damn and you'll feel better," she suggested. "I can express my feelings without blasphemy. And I tell you, you have covered yourself with eternal disgrace and infamy by marrying that drunkard. You would be more endurable if you got drunk occasionally. Barney is not a drunkard. He was seen drunk in Port Lawrence, pickled to the gills," said Uncle Benjamin. "If that is true, and I don't believe it, he had a good reason for it. Now, I suggest that you all stop looking tragic and accept the situation. I'm married. You can't undo that, and I'm perfectly happy." "I suppose we ought to be thankful he has really married her," said Cousin Sarah, by way of trying to look on the bright side. "If he really has," said Uncle James, who had just washed his hands of Valancy. "Who married you?" "Mr. Towers of Port Lawrence." "By a free Methodist?" groaned Mrs. Frederick. As if to have been married by an imprisoned Methodist would have been a shade less disgraceful. It was the first thing she had said. Mrs. Frederick didn't know what to say. The whole thing was too horrible, too nightmarish. She was sure she must wake up soon, after all their bright hopes at the funeral. "It makes me think of those what-do-you-call-'em," said Uncle Benjamin helplessly. "Those yarns, of fairies taking babies out of their cradles." Valancy could hardly be a changeling at 29, said Aunt Wellington satirically. She was the oddest looking baby I ever saw anyway, averred Uncle Benjamin. I said so at the time, you remember, Amelia? I said I have never seen such eyes in a human head. I'm glad I never had any children, said Cousin Sarah. If they don't break your heart in one way, they do it in another. Isn't it better to have your heart broken than to have it wither up? Queried Valancy. Before it could be broken, it must have felt something splendid. That would be worth the pain. Dippy, clean Dippy, muttered Uncle Benjamin, with a vague, unsatisfactory feeling that somebody had said something like that before. Valancy, said Mrs. Frederick solemnly, do you ever pray to be forgiven for disobeying your mother? I should pray to be forgiven for obeying you so long, said Valancy stubbornly. But I don't pray about that at all. I just thank God every day for my happiness. I would rather, said Mrs. Frederick, beginning to cry rather belatedly, see you dead before me than listen to what you have told me today. Valancy looked at her mother and aunts and wondered if they could ever have known anything of the real meaning of love. She felt sorrier for them than ever. They were so very pitiable, and they never suspected it. Barney Snaith is a scoundrel to have deluded you into marrying him, said Uncle James violently. Oh, I did the deluding. I asked him to marry me, said Valancy with a wicked smile. Have you no pride? Demanded Aunt Wellington. Lots of it. I am proud that I have achieved a husband by my own unaided efforts. Cousin Georgiana here wanted to help me to Edward Beck. Edward Beck is worth $20,000 and has the finest house between here and Port Lawrence, said Uncle Benjamin. That sounds very fine, said Valancy scornfully. But it isn't worth that, she snapped her fingers, compared to feeling Barney's arms around me and his cheek against mine. Oh, Dawes, said Cousin Stickles. Cousin Sarah said, Oh, Dawes. Aunt Wellington said, Valancy, you need not be indecent. Why? It surely isn't indecent to like to have your husband put his arm around you. I should think it would be indecent if you didn't. Why expect decency from her? Inquired Uncle James sarcastically. She has cut herself off from decency forevermore. She has made her bed. Let her lie on it. Thanks, said Valancy very gratefully. How you would have enjoyed being Torquemada. Now, I must really be getting back. Mother, may I have those 3 woolen cushions I worked last winter? Take them. Take everything, said Mrs. Frederick. Oh, I don't want everything or much. I don't want my blue castle cluttered. Just the cushions. I'll call for them some day when we motor in. Valancy rose and went to the door. There she turned. She was sorrier than ever for them all. They had no blue castle in the purple solitudes of Miss Tavis. The trouble with you people is that you don't laugh enough, she said. Dawes dear, said Cousin Georgiana mournfully, some day you will discover that blood is thicker than water. Of course it is, but who wants water to be thick? Parried Valancy. We want water to be thin, sparkling, crystal clear. Cousin Stickles groaned. Valancy would not ask any of them to come and see her. She was afraid they would come out of curiosity. But she said, Do you mind if I drop in and see you once in a while, Mother? My house will always be open to you, said Mrs. Frederick with a mournful dignity. You should never recognize her again, said Uncle James sternly, as the door closed behind Valancy. I cannot quite forget that I am a mother, said Mrs. Frederick. My poor, unfortunate girl. I dare say the marriage isn't legal, said Uncle James comfortingly. He has probably been married 6 times before, but I am through with her. I have done all I could, Amelia. I think you will admit that. Henceforth, Uncle James was terribly solemn about it. Valancy is to me as one dead. Mrs. Barney Snaith, said Cousin Georgiana, as if trying it out to see how it would sound. He has a score of aliases, no doubt, said Uncle Benjamin. For my part, I believe the man is half Indian. I haven't a doubt they are living in a wigwam. If he has married her under the name of Snaith, and it isn't his real name, wouldn't that make the marriage null and void? Asked Cousin Stickles hopefully. Uncle James shook his head. No, it is the man who marries, not the name. You know, said Cousin Gladys, who had recovered and returned, but was still shaky. I had a distinct premonition of this at Herbert's silver dinner. I remarked it at the time, when she was defending Snaith. You remember, of course. It came over me like a revelation. I spoke to David when I went home about it. What? Demanded Aunt Wellington of the universe. Has come over Valancy. Valancy. The universe did not answer, but Uncle James did. Isn't there something coming up of late about secondary personalities cropping out? I don't hold with many of those newfangled notions, but there may be something in this one. It would account for her incomprehensible conduct. Valancy is so fond of mushrooms, sighed Cousin Georgiana. I'm afraid she'll get poisoned eating toadstools by mistake living up back in the woods. There are worse things than death, said Uncle James, believing that it was the first time in the world that such statement had been made. Nothing can ever be the same again, sobbed Cousin Stickles. Valancy, hurrying along the dusty road back to cool Miss Davis and her purple island, had forgotten all about them, just as she had forgotten that she might drop dead at any moment if she hurried. End of chapter 27. The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Section 28. Summer passed by. The Stirling clan, with the insignificant exception of Cousin Georgiana, had tacitly agreed to follow Uncle James' example and look upon Valancy as one dead. To be sure, Valancy had an unquiet, ghostly habit of recurring resurrections when she and Barney clattered through Deerwood and out to the port in that unspeakable car. Valancy, bareheaded with stars in her eyes. Barney, bareheaded, smoking his pipe. But shaved. Always shaved now, if any of them had noticed it. They even had the audacity to go into Uncle Benjamin's store to buy groceries. Twice Uncle Benjamin ignored them. Was not Valancy one of the dead, while Snaith had never existed? But the third time he told Barney he was a scoundrel who should be hung for luring an unfortunate, weak-minded girl away from her home and friends. Barney's one straight eyebrow went up. I have made her happy, he said coolly. And she was miserable with her friends, so that's that. Uncle Benjamin stared. It had never occurred to him that women had to be, or ought to be, made happy. You pup, he said. Why be so unoriginal? Queried Barney amiably. Anybody could be a pup. Why not think of something worthy of the Stirlings? Besides, I'm not a pup. I'm really quite a middle-aged dog. 35 if you're interested in knowing. Uncle Benjamin remembered just in time that Valancy was dead. He turned his back on Barney. Valancy was happy, gloriously and entirely so. She seemed to be living in a wonderful house of life, and every day opened a new mysterious room. It was in a world which had nothing in common with the one she had left behind. A world where time was not, which was young with immortal youth, where there was neither past nor future, but only the present. She surrendered herself utterly to the charm of it. The absolute freedom of it all was unbelievable. They could do exactly as they liked. No Mrs. Grundy, no traditions, no relatives or in-laws. Peace, perfect peace with loved ones far away, as Barney quoted shamelessly. Valancy had gone home once and got her cushions, and Cousin Georgiana had given her one of her famous candlewick spreads of most elaborate design. For your spare room bed, dear, she said. But I haven't got any spare room, said Valancy. Cousin Georgiana looked horrified. A house without a spare room was monstrous to her. But it's a lovely spread, said Valancy with a kiss, and I'm so glad to have it. I'll put it on my own bed. Barney's old patchwork quilt is getting ragged. I don't see how you can be contented to live up back, sighed Cousin Georgiana. It's so out of the world. Contented? Valancy laughed. What was the use of trying to explain to Cousin Georgiana? It is, she agreed, most gloriously and entirely out of the world. And you're really happy, dear? Asked Cousin Georgiana wistfully. I really am, said Valancy gravely, her eyes dancing. Marriage is such a serious thing, sighed Cousin Georgiana. When it's going to last long, agreed Valancy. Cousin Georgiana did not understand this at all. But it worried her, and she lay awake at nights wondering what Valancy meant by it. Valancy loved her blue castle and was completely satisfied with it. The big living room had 3 windows, all commanding exquisite view of exquisite Miss Davis. The one in the end of the room was an oriel window, which Tom McMurray, Barney explained, had got out of some little old up-back church that had been sold. It faced the west, and when the sunsets flooded it, Valancy's whole being knelt in prayer, as if in some great cathedral. The new moons always looked down through it. The lower pine boughs swayed about the top of it, and all through the nights the soft, dim silver of the lake dreamed through it. There was a stone fireplace on the other side. No desecrating gas imitation, but a real fireplace where you could burn real logs. With a big grizzly bearskin on the floor before it, and beside it a hideous red plush sofa of Tom McMurray's regime. But its ugliness was hidden by silver-grey timber wolf skins, and Valancy's cushions made it gay and comfortable. In a corner, a nice, tall, lazy old clock ticked. The right kind of a clock, one that did not hurry the hours away, but ticked them off deliberately. It was the jolliest-looking old clock, a fat, corpulent clock with a great round man's face painted on it, the hands stretching out of its nose and the hours encircling it like a halo. There was a big glass case of stuffed owls and several deer heads, likewise of Tom McMurray's vintage. Some comfortable old chairs that asked to be sat upon. A squat little chair with a cushion was prospectively Banjo's. If anybody else dared sit on it, Banjo glared him out of it with his topaz-hued, black-ringed eyes. Banjo had an adorable habit of hanging over the back of it, trying to catch his own tail, losing his temper because he couldn't catch it, giving it a fierce bite for spite when he did catch it, yowling malignantly with pain. Barney and Valancy laughed at him until they ached. But it was Good Luck they loved. They were both agreed that Good Luck was so lovable that he practically amounted to an obsession. One side of the wall was lined with rough, homemade bookshelves filled with books, and between the 2 side windows hung an old mirror in a faded gilt frame, with fat cupids gambolling in the panel over the glass. A mirror, Valancy thought, that must be like the fabled mirror into which Venus had once looked, and which thereafter reflected as beautiful every woman who looked into it. Valancy thought she was almost pretty in that mirror, but that may be because she had shingled her hair. This was before the day of bobs, and was regarded as a wild, unheard-of proceedings, unless you had typhoid. When Mrs. Frederick heard of it, she almost decided to erase Valancy's name from the family Bible. Barney cut the hair square off at the back of Valancy's neck, bringing it down into a short black fringe over her forehead. It gave a meaning and a purpose to her little 3-cornered face that it never had possessed before. Even her nose ceased to irritate her. Her eyes were bright, and her sallow skin had cleared to the hue of creamy ivory. The old family joke had come true. She was really fat at last. Anyway, no longer skinny. Valancy might never be beautiful, but she was of the type that looks its best in the woods, elfin, mocking, alluring. Her heart bothered her very little. When an attack threatened, she was generally able to head it off with Dr. Trent's prescription. The only bad one she had was one night when she was temporarily out of medicine, and it was a bad one. For the time being, Valancy realized keenly that death was actually waiting to pounce on her any moment. But the rest of the time she did not let herself remember it at all. End of chapter 28.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 29. Valancy toiled not, neither did she spin. There was really very little work to do. She cooked their meals on a coal-oil stove, performing all her little domestic rites carefully and exultingly, and they ate out on the veranda that almost overhung the lake. Before them lay Miss Dowis, like a scene out of some fairy tale of old time, and Barney smiling his twisted, enigmatical smile at her across the table. "What a view old Tom picked out when he built this shack," Barney would say exultantly. Supper was the meal Valancy liked best. The faint laughter of winds was always about them, and the colors of the Mistawis, imperial and spiritual under the changing clouds, were something that cannot be expressed in mere words. Shadows, too, clustering in the pines until a wind shook them out and pursued them over the Mistawis. They lay all day along the shores, threaded by ferns and wild blossoms. They stole around the headlands in the glow of the sunset, until twilight wove them all into one great web of dusk. The cats, with their wise, innocent little faces, would sit on the veranda railing and eat the tidbits Barney flung at them. And how good everything tasted! Valancy, amid all the romance of the Mistawis, never forgot that men had stomachs. Barney paid her no end of compliments on her cooking. "After all," he admitted, "there's something to be said for square meals. I've mostly got along by boiling 2 or 3 dozen eggs hard at once and eating a few when I got hungry, with a slice of bacon once in a while and a jorum of tea." Valancy poured tea out of Barney's little battered old pewter teapot of incredible age. She had not even a set of dishes, only Barney's mismatched chip bits, and a dear big pobby old jug of robin's egg blue. After the meal was over, they would sit there and talk for hours, or sit and say nothing, in the languages of the world, Barney pulling away at his pipe, Valancy dreaming idly and deliciously, gazing at the far-off hills beyond Mistawis, where the spires of firs came out against the sunset. The moonlight would begin to silver the Mistawis. Bats would begin to swoop darkly against the pale western gold. A little waterfall that came down on the high bank not far away would, by some whim of the wildwood gods, begin to look like a wonderful white woman beckoning through the spicy, fragrant evergreens. And Leander would begin to chuckle diabolically on the mainland shore. How sweet it was to sit there and do nothing in the beautiful silence, with Barney at the other side of the table smoking. There were plenty of other islands in sight, though none of them were near enough to be troublesome as neighbors. There was one little group of islets far off to the west, which they called the Fortunate Isles. At sunrise they looked like a cluster of emeralds, at sunset like a cluster of amethysts. They were too small for houses, but the lights on the larger islands would bloom out all over the lake, and bonfires would be lighted on their shores, streaming up into the wood shadows, and throwing great blood-red ribbons over the waters. Music would drift to them alluringly from boats here and there, or from the veranda of the big house of the millionaire on the biggest island. "Would you like a house like that, Moonlight?" asked Barney once, waving his hand at it. He had taken to calling her Moonlight, and Valancy loved it. "No," said Valancy, who had once dreamed of a mountain castle 10 times the size of the rich man's cottage, and now pitied the poor inhabitants of palaces. "No, it's too elegant. I would have to carry it with me everywhere I went, on my back like a snail. It would own me, possess me, body and soul. I like a house I can love and cuddle and boss, just like ours here. I don't envy Hamilton Gozard, the finest summer residence in Canada. It is magnificent, but it isn't my blue castle." Away down at the far end of the lake, they got every night a glimpse of a big continental train rushing through the clearing. Valancy liked to watch its lighted windows flash by and wonder who was on it and what hopes and fears it carried. She also amused herself by picturing Barney and herself going to the dances and dinners in the houses on the islands, but she did not want to go in reality. Once they did go to a masquerade dance in the pavilion at one of the hotels up the lake, and had a glorious evening, but slipped away in their canoe before unmasking time, back to the Blue Castle. "It was lovely, but I don't want to go back again," said Valancy. So many hours a day Barney shut himself in the Bluebeard's chamber. Valancy never saw the inside of it. From the smells that filtered through at times, she concluded he must be conducting chemical experiments or counterfeiting money. Valancy supposed there must be smelly processes in making counterfeit money, but she did not trouble herself about it. She had no desire to peer into the locked chambers of Barney's house of life. His past and his future concerned her not, only this rapturous present. Nothing else mattered. Once he went away and stayed away 2 days and nights. He had asked Valancy if she would be afraid to stay alone, and she had said she would not. He never told her where he had been. She was not afraid to be alone, but she was horribly lonely. The sweetest sound she had ever heard was Lady Jane's clatter through the woods when Barney returned, and then his signal whistle from the shore. She ran down to the landing rock to greet him, to nestle herself into his eager arms. They did seem eager. "Have you missed me, Moonlight?" Barney was whispering. "It seems 100 years since you went away," said Valancy. "I won't leave you again." "You must," protested Valancy, "if you want to. I'd be miserable if I thought you wanted to go and didn't because of me. I want you to feel perfectly free." Barney laughed a little cynically. "There's no such thing as freedom on earth," he said. "Only different kinds of bondages, and comparative bondages. You think you are free now because you've escaped from a peculiarly unbearable kind of bondage. But are you? You love me, that's a bondage." "Who said or wrote that the prison unto which we doom ourselves no prison is?" asked Valancy dreamily, clinging to his arm as they climbed up the rock steps. "Ah, now you have it," said Barney. "That's all the freedom we can hope for, the freedom to choose our prison. But Moonlight—" He stopped at the door of the blue castle and looked about him, at the glorious lake, the great shadowy woods, the bonfires, the twinkling lights. "Moonlight, I'm glad to be home again. When I came down through the woods and saw my home lights, mine, gleaming out under the old pines, something I'd never seen before, oh, girl, I was glad, glad." But in spite of Barney's doctrine of bondage, Valancy thought they were splendidly free. It was amazing to be able to sit up half the night and look at the moon if you wanted to be late for meals if you wanted to. She, who had always been rebuked so sharply by her mother and so reproachfully by Cousin Stickles if she were 1 minute late. Dawdle over meals as long as you wanted to. Leave your crusts if you wanted to. Not come home at all for meals if you wanted to. Sit on a sun-warm rock and paddle your bare feet in the hot sand if you wanted to. Just sit and do nothing in the beautiful silence if you wanted to. In short, do any fool thing you wanted to whenever the notion took you. If that wasn't freedom, what was? End of chapter 29.